Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. I imagine that by now many of you already realize that in conjunction with White Crow Books, we've just launched the new Thinking Aloud Dialogues book imprint, and our first title is There Life After Death?
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're going to explore the hypothesis that the ancient gods of all cultures are not just mythological characters or figures, but actually lived, highly evolved beings who visited the earth from another planet. With me in the studio is Neil Freer, writer, researcher, philosopher, and author of Breaking the Godspell. Welcome, Neil.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Nice to be here.
You look at many different lines of evidence that suggest that we ought to take the ancient myths of most cultures when they write about their gods literally, in the sense that these beings walked on this planet in physical bodies. Some of the evidence that you draw on comes from the field of archaeology. There are objects, you've called them ooparts. Can you tell me what ooparts means and give some examples?
Sure. The ooparts is a term that simply means ostensibly high-tech tools, toys, objects, devices that are ostensibly out of time, out of historical sequence. And because they are, we have to ask ourselves who could have used them or invented them or created them back there at that particular time period.
What would be an example?
Very good example is the best one that comes to mind that is a hand-carved wooden model of some object that the archaeologist normally, when they don't know what it really is for, they always call it a ritual or cult object. But they discovered it in the 30s in a temple, in a pyramid, an Egyptian pyramid or tomb. And they put it in a box in a museum. And then by the time the 1950s came around, somebody who had that stuck in the back of their head said, uh-oh. And they went back there into the back room and they pulled it out of the box and they looked at it and they called in some aeronautical engineers and they said, yeah, that looks pretty good to us, and they flew it across the room. The reason why they rediscovered it in the 50s was that it was at that point only that we had come up with swept-wing aircraft. And that's what it was. It was a hand-carved model of swept-wing aircraft. Now, on the large scale, you can take the Temple at Baalbek, a very, very ancient site that was ancient even in the times of the Romans.
In Lebanon.
In Lebanon. The Greeks and the Romans made it a point to, when they conquered those territories or went there, to actually put effort and wealth into rebuilding this place because they knew that it was a very important ancient site. One of the amazing things is that when you see a picture of it with a man standing at the base of it, he looks like a fly compared to the size of the blocks that form, many of the huge blocks that form the base of it, some of which have been measured at weighing 1,100 tons. There is no technology whatsoever in the world that we have that would even come close to being able to handle such a thing, much less cut it with precision and move it.
Even today?
Even today. When they made the Aswan Dam, created the Aswan Dam project, then they had to move huge stone sculptures out of the way. They called in experts from all over the world and they cut the things up in pieces, relatively small pieces, and moved them that way.
But the stone blocks at Baalbek are much larger.
Totally solid. I mean, they're enormous. I mean, consider 2,000 pounds times 1,100 tons.
So there are, I understand, hundreds, perhaps thousands of objects like that whose origins are still unfathomable to us in terms of our technology and science.
Right. And then to bring it down to a more prosaic level, we have, it points up how we began the study of archaeology. because the Judeo-Christian tradition had mitigated against us having a science of archaeology until about 150 years ago, when a precocious German, who was not an archaeologist or even a scientist, but who was a person who had read many of the ancient legends, it was myth and legend, about the ancient cities, he said, this cannot be. I have maps from the ancient times. So he took one of those maps and he went down to the Middle East and he went to the city, or to the location where the city of Troy was supposed to be, and he dug deep enough and he found Troy. And of course, we had newspapers at that time, and his beautiful life was pictured in the newspapers, standing there with all the beautiful gold jewelry around his neck and so on.
This would be an example of a situation in which we once thought Troy was simply a myth, that it wasn't a real city, and subsequently we know otherwise.
Precisely. And that has followed through. We have discovered site after site after site in the Middle East, and they fall out and in the exact locations, and they are even more breathtaking in their splendor in many cases than as described even in the ancient text.
But it's a big step to say that, yes, this city existed, than to say that the mythological gods were actually highly evolved beings in physical bodies that walked the earth and talked and taught us technologies and so on.
Yes, because it is true that even though they were said to have vimanas, airplanes in the ancient text, and they were described, and they were said to fly through space in craft that belched fire, rockets, quite obviously. Even some depicted on the ancient stone monuments, actual photo carvings of bullet-like objects with flames coming out of the back of them. It is circumstantial evidence. We have to say that, as a caveat right up front, as any evidence in archaeology certainly is. But when we look at the wealth of material of ooparts, those things that are totally out of place in time, that men were obviously not capable of, never said they were capable of, and we look at the other factors that are, or vectors, if you will, that are coming to bear on the subject, I think that we have a circumstantial case that is so strong that if it were circumstantial evidence presented in a court of law, it would certainly lead to a conviction.
Now, you are very much influenced by the writings of Zecharia Sitchin.
That's correct.
Who is a historian, a translator of ancient Sumerian texts. Sitchin takes these texts literally, doesn't he?
He does, yes. He's one of 200 Sumerian scholars in the world that can pick up a clay tablet and read it like you and I can read a newspaper. I have a great deal of respect for the integrity and scope of his work. And basically what Sitchin is doing is agreeing with all of the other archaeological positions. He says, yes, it is true that the ancient Sumerian civilization was a sudden civilization. There were no predecessors. They did have all of the institutions that we have now, including limited forms of democratic government, medicine, trilingual dictionaries, schools, universities, and so on. It is very difficult, it's almost a new part. How do you explain a sudden civilization in that sense with no predecessors? But over and above that, he also would go one step farther. Instead of saying, as traditionally we have in the academic world, that the gods were mythological, because of the things they could do, fly through space, fly through the atmosphere, create human beings, use weapons like starboard lasers and so on. He says we have to look at the technology we have today and see that we can do all those things. Those reasons are vaporized. So we must take at least another look. And when we look at the texts that have developed over the last 150 years from the archaeological digs, it is quite clear to him, and I have tried 7 or 8 years to break his case, so to speak, that he is saying very accurately what the truth is. And that is that those gods came from off-planet, outer space, from another planet in our solar system, a 10th one, which the evidence for which we can examine in a minute. We're here for taking huge amounts of gold out of the planet, not for wealth or jewelry, but to do some kind of special molecular seeding of the atmosphere of their planet, perhaps as a heat shield or whatever, because it went so far out past our sun, that they created human beings 300,000 years ago when they had a rebellion in their gold mines. We even have, if the ancient records are correct, we even have the conversations that took place when their lower echelons laid down their tools, created a rebellion and a work strike in their gold mines in South Africa, and forced their geneticists to create a creature to take their place. This is, I will put the other caveat down here, it is the most unthinkable thought in Western culture. But I believe that it is literally true. And we have the keys to restoring our true history to ourselves.
Now, these stories are written in clay tablets that have been found in the ruins in the area that's now Iraq, primarily the ancient kingdoms of Sumeria and Babylonia and Akkadian and Chaldea and so on. The clay tablets were probably created 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, and you're claiming that the events described in these clay tablets date back hundreds of thousands of years.
That's correct. And the reason I'm saying that is that it is also recorded in those tablets that the reason we have this information in the first place is that it was taught to us. That the gods first created us as a genetically engineered species by fusing, genetically splicing their genes with the only indigenous hominid around on the planet at that point, at the end point of our natural evolution at this point, planet, Homo erectus. Having done so and created a new bicameral species, if you will, with two major genetic codes, we were mutants and couldn't procreate. They eventually gave us the ability to procreate. We became precocious. Perhaps they being, it appears from the ancient records, at a level of technology and in a level of technology that we have only reached now, that they perhaps didn't even know the full consequences of what that genetic engineering event would transpire, how it would transpire. And so we became precocious and intelligent more than probably they really wanted. They wanted a strong creature with enough intelligence to do their gold mining, but not to give them any problems, not to give them any trouble. But it turned out differently, and we became eventually partners with them. And in the process of being taught literally crash courses in civilization and given technology, we see that we were taught this stuff, and we were eventually taught to write it down. And since it was the most important event, since it bore on our actual genesis as a species, it has been recorded in all those societies, and it's basically a transcultural phenomenon.
In other words, if you were to look at the most ancient legends of Egypt, of Sumeria, of India, of South America, you would find certain parallels.
That's very true. It is Joseph Campbell, one of the most respected of our comparative mythologists in the Masks of God series. He spent 12 years in intense research on that, and he answered a question that he posed to himself at the very beginning of that work in a very startling way. He said, is all of this mythology, which seems so completely the same over the face of the planet, even the genealogies of the gods, who married whom and who was whose cousin, even though the languages were different because the languages used different names for them, they were the same whether it was in the Vedic traditions in India or in the Norse tradition in Norway. And he said, so the question must be posed, is it the common reaction of the human neurological system to, in a naive fashion, to the processes of nature like thunder and lightning and so on? And he said, when I look at the history and I look at my material, it can't be that way. It was not that way. He said, something happened in Sumeria. I don't know exactly what it was, and he postulated, as with all establishment scholars up to his point, that the gods were mythological. But he said it is quite obvious that something happened in Sumeria and it spread all over the world.
Well, most scholars today, of course, assume that the stories of the flood and the creation, the Garden of Eden, many of the stories of the Old Testament are actually summaries of much more extensive legends that have been written in the earlier Sumerian records.
That's true. Up until about 150 years ago, the general mindset of Western culture in the Judeo-Christian tradition was that the ancient Old Testament was given as revelatory material, that it was given to the prophets and the scribes and so on, pretty much as just there, and write it down. But all of the scholars, including Sitchin, at this point in time, recognize that over the last 150 years, again, the archaeological material has made it quite clear that the Old Testament, as we know it in the Bible, is a very recent, relatively recent event, and it is a synopsis, a very brief synopsis of what has been recovered on those documents from even as far back as the Sumerians. What was history of the Sumerians is written down in synopsis.
And of course, if you read the book of Genesis in the original Hebrew, you'll find some interesting things, like the word Elohim is constantly used by the Jewish people to refer to God, and yet anyone who knows Hebrew would tell you this is a plural word.
Right. It is interesting that in the previous Semitic languages and in the Hebrew, what people don't pay too much attention to is the fact that El is the singular, Elohim is the plural. But there are some other etymological trails of evidence that are very significant and fascinating. For instance, in the Sumerian, the word Anunnaki means those who came down, meaning from the heavens. It was a major term that was applied to the ancient gods, whom the ancient civilizations said they could speak to, get information from, get blueprints from to build them new temples, where they could converse with them and serve them food and so on. That word is etymologically traceable up through, Anunnaki is etymologically traceable up through the other Semitic languages until it gets to the Old Hebrew, where it becomes Anakim. And then eventually it is related to the word Nephilim, which is used in the 6th chapter of Genesis, which has been a horror of for translators because it speaks of plural gods.
Isn't that the reference to that giants lived on the world in the earth in those days, and they mated with the daughters of men, something
Precisely.
to that effect? Yes.
But it is also true that even though in a last-ditch effort, so to speak, to somehow or other modify that text, the word Nephilim was translated giants. It does not in the Old Hebrew mean anything of the sort. It means, again, those who came down from the heavens, meaning from the heavens. It was, and so that text becomes extremely significant because it says, and please don't hold me to exactly each word, but it says before the flood and after the flood, the Nephilim were on the earth. And the sons of those gods became enamored of the daughters of men, took on themselves wives, as many as they wanted, and eventually they bore children to them. This turns out to be when we go back and look at the ancient texts that are in volumes that describe this event, which in the 6th chapter is in a few sentences.
Yes.
What really happened was that after we had been genetically engineered 300,000 years ago as slave animals, they discovered that we were mutants, as a mule is. Any genetically engineered, manipulated being usually is sterile. They eventually, because they wanted more and more of us, gave us the ability to procreate. Then it became difficult for them because, again, they may not have been able to judge, but we spread all over the place. And that's where it's fascinating. The story of Genesis takes over in the Garden of Eden story, because it is a cryptic metaphor for the fact that the surplus then was pushed into the outback, out of the Nephilim centers, and started probably the huge migrations that eventually ended up in the southern tip of South America.
In other words, if we look at the story of the Garden of Eden, from your perspective, you're sort of saying, well, these gods created human beings to work for them in the garden.
Precisely.
And then they were given the ability to procreate and ended up being sort of exiled from the garden.
Right. First we were created for the gold mines in South Africa. And it's very fascinating. Another interesting correlation here and reinforcement from modern science is the fact that when you read the journals of the gold mining industry in South Africa right now, they refer to the fact that very seldom do they go looking geologically in the typical geological fashion for gold mines. They simply go looking for the traces of the ancient ones. There are 65,000-year-old gold mines in South Africa that they have rediscovered precisely in the location where the laboratories and the gold mines were that we were invented for. Some of them they tentatively have dated 100,000 years ago. So it's again another part. We didn't know that, of anyone who had the technology to do that.
In other words, what you're telling me is that the clay tablets from the Middle East, the area that is now Iraq, describes gold mining operations in South Africa?
That's precisely correct. Because they were here for gold, and having a work strike invented us to take their place. Eventually they also, and it's a detailed account, but they vied for us so much that some of them went down there and actually took some of the slave animals to the Middle East to do the to do their menial tasks.
Yeah.
And that's how we ended up in Eden, which is the part of the Middle East that the Old Testament is referring to.
In the Fertile Crescent region.
Precisely.
Right.
Right.
Now, I gather then that the different, well, we might call them tribal gods of various cultures, Yahweh, Ishtar, and so on, you are suggesting these are actual personalities.
That's precisely correct. We should distinguish between later inventions or political creations of opportunistic shamans, or the product of naive minds who were so far separated in space, perhaps in the ions in the Pacific and so on, who did react to natural phenomena. But we're talking here about the main traditions that are found of our creation, of the flood. The American Indians, the American Indian cultures contain 42 variations on the flood story. The Orinoco Indians knew the flood story. So it is that type of hardcore tradition that I'm referring to here.
Well, tell me more about the flood story. I think you suggested earlier that the Nephilim actually, these gods had decided that, that they were going to destroy the genetic experiment they had created.
The last straw came when their younger males became enamored of the daughters of men. We became a stable species, and the females particularly became attracted to the Nephilim males. And this was totally objectionable to the Nephilim ruling class and the rulers here on the planet. And they decided, we have the records, if they're true, that say that they voted in council to let the entire experiment be flooded out and wipe out the humans because it was getting totally out of hand. And the event that they were going to let, when they were going to let this happen, was when their planet came in through the asteroid belt the next time around. So as a digression here, perhaps we should develop that concept of their planet for a bit.
Yes.
They said, they taught us that they had come from the last planet in our solar system, which is a Neptune-sized planet that circles the sun once every 3,600 years, comes in through the asteroid belt, goes way out in a huge, elongated, extended cometary orbit, way out past Pluto, and it's tipped up to the plane of the ecliptic, the flat plane of the other planets, by about 30 some odd degrees and so on. Well,
I mean, you can find that kind of precision in the ancient records.
Precisely. And also we have a cylinder seal where we have a depiction of our sun with all of the planets that we know today, even though Tombaugh discovered Pluto ostensibly in 1930, as late as that. We have a picture of our sun on one of their cylinder seals, those hard stone rolling pin devices, that show all the planets in our solar system, including our moon and so on, including that 10th planet in its proper location.
Well, how do astronomers today view this notion?
It's very fascinating. I've talked to and discussed this with modern astronomers. Now, a lot of people don't realize that astronomers from JPL and NASA and the Naval Observatory have been looking for Planet X, it's called that in the popular press, for a long time. They thought they had it when Pluto was discovered, and they found, no, that isn't the one. They see a definite gravitational pull on the path, on the orbital path of two of the major outer planets, Uranus and Neptune. And as a result, they can extrapolate, and they have already claimed that this Neptune-sized planet, some of them say that it's they are so sure that it's there that all we have to do is name it. And it may have been picked up by the IRIS, the infrared imaging satellite, in 1963-64. But they say that it must take at least 800 to 1,000 years once around our sun. It is tipped up to the plane of the ecliptic by 30 some odd degrees and so on. So we're getting, the astronomers, even though they emphatically deny that it could ever correspond to the Sumerian documents and the Sumerian traditions and history, because they will not disagree with the archaeologist. I mean, there's a very close dance going on between the archaeologist and the astronomer at that point, reinforcing each other. They simply won't admit that that's the planet, but they keep coming closer and closer to an exact description of that planet itself.
And so to get back to the flood story, now you're suggesting that if we were to take these Sumerian legends literally, at a certain time in our very ancient history, when that planet was approaching the Earth, something took place that resulted in a flood.
They knew at that time, apparently, quite clearly, what we knew, only we had learned, I think I read the article originally probably about 20 years ago in Scientific American, and that was that a scientist had postulated at that point that the entire Antarctic ice shelf can build up a slush layer on itself, and by the configuration of the geology of Antarctica, that huge mass could slide off and create instantaneous havoc in the weather systems and obviously quite huge flooding. And apparently knowing that, they said, when our planet comes in the next time, we will go off in the spaceships and we'll let the entire experiment be flooded out. One of them was forced to vote in council affirmatively, but he did not like this idea at all. He was in sympathy with the humans. He did not want it to happen. So he did a very rationalized, chintzy, if I may use the term, act. He went to one of his favorite humans and he said, stand on the other side of this reed screen. I'm not going to be talking to you, but I'm going to be talking to the reed screen. It turns out this is the way that we see it described in the Old Testament, and the name for that human was Noah. In the Sumerian it was Utnapishtim, but the records are identical. In fact, in much greater detail in the Sumerians. And so what happened was he gave him directions on how to build a relatively very sophisticated semi-submersible. It was not a box that floated on the surface, but something that would take the tossing and turning. And he said a very interesting thing to him. He said, when you see fire and thunder in Shamash, get in, batten down the hatches because it's going to come down on you. Yeah. It turns out that Shamash was one of their spaceports. So what he was saying to him is, when you see us light the candle and go up in the rocket ships and you see that fire and thunder, get in and go for it. That was very close to a total annihilation of the human species.
Well, Neil, these are extremely provocative ideas and quite an interesting hypothesis. We have about a minute left, and I think it's very important to leave our viewers with some sense of what you think, if this hypothesis is correct, the implications are for us alive today, now.
I think it is quite clear that we now have at hand the ability to step out of the adolescence of the race. We can reevaluate the three parts of religion. Institutionalized religion in this context, if it is correct, is the sublimation in a very classically Jungian sense of the old master-slave relationship. We can see that transcendental experience is the participation at the leading edge of our peculiar special case of evolution. We are being pushed by the advanced Nephilim component through a rapid metamorphosis of exploration. See the robot prying into its circuitry, if you will, for a poor metaphor, to determine the answers to the beginning questions in the philosophy book. Who are we and where do we come from? And to expand our awareness. The occult, which is another...
No time for the occult, Neil.
Okay. Well,
we're really out of time now.
Okay,
Neil Freer, thanks so much. You're really giving us a new vision of humanity, a little below the angels and a little above the beasts, as they say. Thanks so much for being with me.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us.
We've just released issue number 2 of the New Thinking Aloud quarterly magazine. You can download a free copy at the New Thinking Aloud Foundation website, newthinkingaloud.org.